And welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Hypertrophy Past and Present. And as always today, we've got a new topic for you and we've got a new workout plan for you. And hopefully we've got an interesting conversation for you all. Now, just before we jump into it, I do want to say I've had a few people asking if the captions are available for our podcast, and they're all available. They're all on YouTube. So if you're one of the people from one of 100 different countries of people who listen to us, then, and English is your second language, you can hop on YouTube and find the captions there, and I'll make it a little bit easier. Anyway, welcome to the show. Chris, how are you today?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Jake. Obviously about to go traveling, so a little bit of upheaval, but ready to talk about this new routine today.
You're about to go traveling, and I'm currently doing a mini travel.
You are?
So we're going to be swapping roles in a few weeks. So today, we have what I think is a nice plan following on from last week's episode. So if you guys missed last week's episode, we were looking at one of Reg Park's plans. And Reg Park was the first bodybuilder to bench 500 pounds, which is a pretty phenomenal effort. And something that maybe people don't necessarily know or realize is that some of these bodybuilders, or most of these bodybuilders in the silver era, not only were they the biggest people on the planet, they were also the strongest people on the planet. So Reg Park, second person ever to bench 500 pounds. Today, we're going to talk about the third person to bench 500 pounds, Marvin Eder. And some of the strength feats of these bodybuilders in the silver era were just phenomenal. And, they were, not only were they performing these strength feats and doing shows with these strength feats, and obviously bodybuilding came out of a lot of these sort of strongman kind of events in the bronze era, but they were even competing at very high levels, like in Olympics. So, for example, John Grimmick was competing in the Olympics for weightlifting. So these people undoubtedly were phenomenally strong. So Marvin Eder, who we're going to be talking about one of his plans today, he, obviously we're talking sort of 1950, so maybe there's been some embellishment. I know you and I were having a bit of a discussion about this yesterday, so take it with a grain of salt. There is photographic evidence, but obviously photos can be staged, whatever else. But supposedly Marvin Eder was, like I said, the third person to bench 500 pounds. And he actually did a 515 pound bench. And that one I think is fairly credible, because there was many spectators who witnessed that. But supposedly he's been credited with doing 12 single arm chin-ups and also doing a 197 kilo dip. That's 197 kilos attached to his body. So this is the weight of two large men. And in the photo, there was two large men who were wrapped around his waist as he was performing a dip. Now, I know you're dying to make a comment, so go.
No, not really. I think that there are lifts where you can kind of get your head around them and say, okay, no, I understand that. And then there are lifts where you kind of go, no, I just can't. I would have to see that being done to actually believe it. And I think that dip, for me, as somebody who has spent many years getting their dip to a level that other people find quite frightening, I've had people literally stare at me in gyms when I've been doing dips with 1.25 body weight hanging off my waist. To see somebody doing it with 2.5 times body weight hanging off their waist, that's like double what I could do, which is, and I'm not saying that I'm anything special. I'm just saying that I took a lift to a relatively extreme obsessive point, and to the point where people were like, yeah, no, that's heavy. And then have somebody double that, for me, that's just a little bit tricky for me to get my head around. Now,
so what was your max dip weight? How much weight?
About 85, but that was like I probably managed to get sort of a double with that, really. It was a very clean single, and there was capacity, and I was weighing just over 70, 72, something like that. So that was tough, and I was doing one arm chins at the same time. So I can kind of for me, that's ballpark. When somebody comes along, they're like, okay, and just another comment on that. When I was doing those lifts, my overall physique looked more like a climber than like a bodybuilder. So I was very, very lean, very, very kind of thin, if you like, really. You wouldn't have noticed that I was, lifting weights when I had clothes on. It's just you don't see it because you need to keep your body weight quite low when you're doing those kind of, well, you don't need to, but it helps a lot. If you look at the picture of Marvin Eder doing that dip with the two guys hanging off him, he looks like a bodybuilder. He looked massive. I think, again, the context, it's like you shared some photos of the guy who's currently got the world record in the dip, which is not
Which
far
I think is
away.
worth noting. Yeah. So his dip is, I believe, is about 195, 194 kilos, something along those lines.
So it's very close to
a couple kilos in it. Yeah.
His physique looks nothing like Marvin Eder's does. So
he's much lighter as well. He'd be about 20 kilos lighter.
Basically, like, if I kind of look to him now, he looks like a much more muscular version of what I looked like when I was doing sort of silly dips and one-arm chins in the past, which is what I would expect. It looks like a bigger version of a climber, really, whereas Eder looked like a bodybuilder who just was doing. So for me, the two, I'm not trying to hijack this podcast and start debating whether, because it's not the point. It's not the point. Clearly, Marvin Eder had enormous dip strength. And the point I'm making is when you've done a lift to a point where you know it really, really well, and you've got to a high level in that lift, then when somebody comes along and claims that they've doubled it, you kind of go, I know what that would take. And there are discrepancies between what I would expect to see and what I'm seeing. And therefore, I'm just going to withhold judgment on that, because unless I saw it happen, I would be really straining my brain to understand how it happened. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I believe it's probably slightly exaggerated.
I think that's fair. If their metric for measuring the weight of the dip was literally the body weight of these two people, then I think it would be easy enough to be like, yeah, I weigh this much, like on a good day.
Maybe
so I can see that there's probably a few
5
kilos in
or
it.
so. But the point is, clearly it was an enormous dip strength. Clearly he was enormously strong, and that's kind of the point of using this guy as the marker, the kind of example routine of a strength routine in this particular context. So don't want to derail this stuff. I'm just, for me, it was just an unusual situation, because most of the time we talk about people's deadlift strength or squat strength, and I'm like, I'm not an aficionado of those lifts. I don't know those lifts intimately. I know how to do one-arm chins. I know how to do, weighted pull-ups and weighted dips to a point that most people will not get to unless they develop a unhealthy obsession with it like I did. And so when I see somebody in the past having a benchmark number in those categories, I become interested, and I'm like, I can comment on that because it's something I know about. It's very rare for me to be in that situation. Most of the time I'm talking about physiology. Like, I know that very, very well. But this is one of those very rare situations where I actually do know about the practicalities of a lift.
For what it's worth, I think it's interesting to note that the current world record holder, who's sitting at 194, 195 kilos, whatever it was, he was also a record holder in his body weight. His previous lift was 140 kilos. So he's actually upped the record by 50 odd kilos it was only a matter of 1 or 2 years. So that might actually tie into what we're going to discuss later today. Now, moving on from dips, let's talk about the plan. So Marvin Eder, obviously very strong guy. No doubt about that. Whether he did the 197 kilo dip or not, he was definitely strong. Now, this was a plan that he put forward in the early 50s, and he wrote about in a magazine, and he coined this or talked about this as a power mass routine. So he was a big advocate, obviously, for gaining strength and gaining mass, and they, use terminology like bulking or massing or mass routines here. So this is kind of the premise of this type of plan, was one that was going to make someone gain strength as well as gain large amounts of muscle. Now, obviously, we've noted that he was he had multiple, high level lifts, not just a dip, but also the bench, also the chin up. And elsewhere, he talks about specializing in those particular lifts and how he would do that, and, how one might, for example, choose specific exercises around a particular lift. But this is just an example of a power mass routine. So here we have, what I might do actually is go through the exercises, and then I'll circle back around to how he structured the sets and reps, because it's quite different to what we've seen so far. So as far as exercise selection, as was generally the case, he was using a full body plan, and he started with the squat. He then went into bench. He then suggested going to a bent over barbell row, and he used a closer to mid grip here, not a wide grip like we've seen in the past. And then went into a standing overhead press, where he was again using a relatively sort of mid grip, and then a wide pronated grip lat pull down, which I'm sure you'll be happy to see. And then he concluded with dumbbell curls. Now, the set and rep structure for this program actually changed. He used a form of periodization here. And for the first 2 weeks, he did 3 sets of 8. Now, just as I read this out, for you guys who listened to our episode last week, keep this in mind, or keep those sort of sets that we talked about in terms of recoverable volume in mind as we talk about the sets here. So he did 3 sets of 8 for the first 2 weeks. He then moved into 4 sets of 6 for 2 weeks. And then he suggested having a lighter week. Now, he didn't, as you know, was generally the case with a lot of these guys, he didn't go into a lot of specificity over what that looked like, but it was some form of a deload. He then suggested going into 5 sets of 5 and pushing up to 7, so 5 by 5 to 7 for a month. And then for the final month, he did 3 lots of triples and also did 3 sets of 6. So he sort of combined the lower reps with the moderate reps, and he did that for a month. And then I suppose he sort of rinsed and repeated. Now, there's a fair bit there. What are your initial thoughts?
Various things. As you say, it's really interesting to see somebody who obviously developed their back strength to the point where they could do one-arm chin-ups was focusing on wide grip pull-ups, which I think is important because it does give you a lot more back or lat development, I think, in terms of the lower, middle and lower regions, rather than just focusing on the upper region, which you would get from a sagittal plane narrow grip movement. That's interesting straight away. It's interesting that we've got this periodization appearing very clearly, perhaps the first time we've talked about that on this podcast. But really, the highlight is the point that you've already made, which is that if you look at the rep ranges here, so if we're training 3 times a week, 3 sets, 3 times a week for moderate loads, 8 reps. That's exactly what we've been seeing in the recoverability data that, you know, we've been talking about forever. If we drop down to a heavier rep range of 6s suddenly, or 5s even, you can do an extra couple of sets. Well, again, that's what we talked about last week. So it's really, really cool a visualization example of this need to stay within the recoverable volume zone. And really, you know, that's the backdrop for a lot of the controversy that we're seeing at the moment, and not going into this and derailing the podcast yet again, but that's the backdrop again for this debate that we're seeing at the moment where people are saying, no, you can do a zillion sets a week and carry on getting stronger and bigger. And it's like, well, hang on a minute. How come every single bodybuilder pre-steroids didn't do that? And they actually nail the numbers that we're seeing in the physiology and the recoverability data today. How come they actually nailed those numbers perfectly? Literally 3 sets of moderate loads 3 times a week. That's literally exactly what the physiology data says today and the recoverability data say today. So how come they were doing that? You know, like, and everybody prior to that, you know, was training with lower volumes and higher frequencies as well. So it's really, really important, I think, to emphasize that observation that you've made, which is that the rep ranges and the volumes with those rep ranges in the context of the 3 times a week frequency stack up perfectly with what we've been saying and what.
So well, it's so interesting, isn't it? Like, you just go back and listen to last week and it's
remarkable.
Exactly.
And then I guess really it's interesting that he's focusing on a small number of exercises similar to Reg Park, I guess, focusing on a small number of exercises rather than taking that bodybuilding approach of, you know, having a larger number of exercises and covering kind of a larger amount of the body. It's, you know, clearly he had a very dedicated strength focus, which is, you know, kind of why we're using that as an example this time.
Yeah, yeah. And for a little bit more context on Marvin Eder, so he did not compete for very long. He was sort of, there was a bit of politics happening at the time that he was competing, and he competed for York, and then he kind of got banned from competing with the WIDA sanctioned events. And so he wasn't a competitive bodybuilder for very long, and his feats were more strength-based feats. So that might also inform some of the exercise selection we're seeing here. And I didn't note this, but he had I don't know if it was a record overhead press, but it was certainly close to it. But I don't recall exactly how much load it was. So, you know, obviously we see both the bench and overhead press in here, and he was obviously a very renowned lifter for both of those. Any other comments on either the exercise selection or anything else we see outline-wise?
No, I mean, I think this is one of those routines that we will probably come back to as a comparison as we keep doing these, kind of discoveries each week and look at more and more routines, I think we will come back to this and go, do you remember when we talked about Marvin Eder and he had that feature of his routine? Because, there's some interesting stuff here, especially around that periodization model. I think a lot of the time I tend to just reject periodization because physiologically there's very little going on, if anything. But maybe there's something, like I always say, I don't like to simply reject information out of hand and go, that's irrelevant, I'm just going to ignore it. I don't do that. I just kind of like put it in a drawer and leave it and remember that it's there. And then if I then see something later on and come back to it and say, well, does that now fit with the information that we've already seen? As we go through these routines week on week, will there be a moment in the future when we have some more periodization information or something else that triggers us to come back and look at this and go, actually, that now fits with why they were doing that, and maybe that explains this. And you start to build up a picture of what's going on. Ultimately, you can't really build a picture without all of these little pieces of information. The fact that I can't say anything incisive about this right now doesn't mean that we won't be able to use that usefully in the future, is the point that I'm making. So that's the best I can do. Right?
Which is generally the story of my life when it comes to these silver era routines, where I see them the first time and I think, oh, that's interesting. That doesn't necessarily make sense to me. Or even more to the point, I might just gloss over something and then 6 months later be like, holy moly, they were doing what? And then it starts to fit based on something else that we discover nowadays. So we probably will make comments on this again in the future. There was one thing I was going to mention, and it's escaping me now. I'm sure it'll come back to me. But I do want to, so I mentioned obviously the current world record holder for the dip, and I do want to potentially use that maybe as a segue into what we're going to talk about. How is it possible that someone who's a very advanced lifter could potentially add 10, 20, 30, 40 kilos to a very advanced lift at late stages in the career? That is unbelievable. And even Marvin Eder, I should say, he, for his body weight, he was the first person, I believe, to bench 400 pounds. And then within a matter of 1 to 2 years, he was then benching 515, which is just unbelievable increases in load.
Well, basically, there would be two ways that would happen. Either it would be a complete radical change in the technique of the exercise. And you do see that from time to time in athletic situations where somebody changes. I mean, there's some very famous examples, but, somebody changes the way they're doing something and then suddenly the performance of that event just jumps up a notch. The problem is that when you see that happening, what you should notice is that everybody within a couple of years adopts that new way of doing it, and then everybody's now like 20%, 30% better. If that doesn't happen, then generally speaking, in a context of a strength sport, the only way you're going to do that is move up a weight class. Those are the two ways. That's
very interesting. In the context of bench, at this point in time, bench records are dropping like nothing else. So that is interesting. I do wonder what had shifted around the early 1950s, where we do see people adding 50 to 100 pounds on top bench presses in only a year or two. So maybe that's my homework.
Obviously, Marvin Eder was a renowned, people talk about his dip strength as being the kind of the marker of his kind of achievements. And so perhaps that tricep strength and the change from a bench press, which perhaps was wider to one that was slightly narrower. Again, I'm speaking as someone who does not know the bench press intimately like I do other lifts, but, that's potentially one of the factors.
And that could be it, because he does talk about, in contrast to someone like Reg Park, Reg was very big on very wide gripping bench. And he would often talk about any of these pressing movements use as wide a grip essentially as possible. And Marvin Eder, he does talk about using a much more narrow grip, not super narrow, but he does use more mid grip. So he's going to get a bit more triceps involvement there. So that may well be part of it.
So I think this is a great opportunity to just cover, like we covered fatigue in previous episodes and tried to encapsulate that in a short period of time. I'd like to just encapsulate how strength gains work. And then as a corollary of that, just describe how hypertrophy contributes to strength gains, really. So just trying to get our hands around this, or our arms around this subject very quickly. When we talk about strength and strength increases, we're talking about an outcome that we're measuring externally. So in the same way, when we talked about fatigue mechanisms and fatigue, I said fatigue itself is the measurable temporary reduction in strength or exercise performance. It's not a physiological mechanism itself. It is an outcome that we measure externally. When we look beneath that and go, okay, well, what's making that happen? Why am I noticing these changes in strength as a result of doing a couple of sets of strength training exercise? Well, mechanistically, these are the things that are changing, and that's what make That's what makes the kind of reduction in strength or reduction in performance occur. The same thing happens with strength gains. So if I look at a 2-3 month strength training program and I notice that somebody's increased their 1 rep max bench press or whatever by this percentage, that's a strength increase. That strength increase is not itself a physiological thing. We are not, like I often say in my mentorship course, we're not computer sprites where you can say, I've got 76 points of strength. And no, we don't work like that. The strength is a measurement. So people say, I need to develop strength. I'm like, well, no, you don't, because you can't. The strength is the outcome measurement. What you're trying to develop is an increase perhaps in a strength mechanism or an adaptation. And that leads us then to analyze, well, what are the strength mechanisms? And so like there's 6 that I talk about regularly. You can add an extra one on there just for completeness. And then maybe there's a couple that we can mention that are potentially discussed, but probably don't contribute. So very quickly, we've got 3 major neural mechanisms of strength gains, 3 adaptations that happen. We've got improvements in coordination. So we practice the lift and get better at it. We've got increases in, let me do them in the correct order. We've got the improvements in coordination. We've got reductions in antagonist co-activation. Now, the reason I like to place this next to improvements in coordination is because many people group them together, and that's totally valid. You can do that if you want to do that. So you can just say like it's another type of coordination because it really does work the same way. You're just reducing, like for example, if you're doing curls and your biceps are doing the lift, your triceps are actually getting in the way. They are stabilizing a joint, but they're producing a braking force. If you reduce the triceps activation, your curl strength will go up, even though your biceps muscle strength hasn't actually changed as a muscle force output. So you've got this improvement in coordination practicing the lift. You've got this antagonist co-activation reduction, which is again kind of practicing the lift and making that adaptation happen. And then thirdly, your final major neural adaptation that contributes to strength in these kind of maximum strength kind of situations rather than speed situations is an increase in motor unit recruitment. So we're increasing the number of muscle fibers that you can actually activate. And that's the first time you're really going to see the actual muscle increase in the force output. The coordination and the co-activation reductions are just efficiency modifiers. You're just becoming more efficient at applying the muscle forces that you've got available to you to make the external environment change. And that, just commenting back on what we just talked about, that's where I would say if you see a whole generation of bench presses suddenly jump up by 25%, it's because of that coordination, that co-activation side of things, rather than probably because of anything else. So those are our 3 kind of neural adaptations. And then just kind of completing the picture, we've got stuff happening more peripherally. Obviously, we've got hypertrophy now. Just a very quick note on terminology here. When we say hypertrophy in the wider fitness industry and in the widest possible sense, we tend to just mean an increase in muscle mass. Now, technically, hypertrophy actually only refers to an increase in the diameter of single muscle fibers. So if you really want to be complete here, you have to stuff sarcomerogenesis into this category as well. So sarcomerogenesis does, let me just kind of put them in the correct order. Hypertrophy of muscle fibers, an increase in the number of myofibrils, an increase in the diameter of the fiber, that will increase muscle fiber force. Now, I'm going to come back to this point and talk through that in more detail momentarily, but I just want to clarify that if you're adding more myofibrils inside a fiber, the fiber will get stronger. If you've got more fibers that are larger inside a muscle, you're going to create more of a muscle force that then contributes to joint torque. So it's very difficult to add myofibrils and not have that contribute to an increase in strength. Sarcomeres added already the same thing. Some people don't understand why that happens. It's because of lateral force transmission, which I'll come to. So basically what we've got is an addition of muscle size, either through hypertrophy in the strictest sense of the term, which means an increase in the diameter of the muscle fiber, or due to the addition of sarcomeres in series, which increases the length of the muscle fiber. The other 2 mechanisms peripherally are then going to be an increase in tendon stiffness. Basically, the reason this works is because if you have a compliant tendon, when you pull the muscle, when the muscle pulls on the tendon, if the tendon is compliant, it gives a little bit. And now the muscle shortens a little bit quicker than you were expecting it to. As a result, it now works closer to the velocity end of the force velocity spectrum than it was doing previously. If the tendon does not move, then of course the muscle can now move more slowly, and that allows it to then produce a higher force in accordance with the force velocity relationship. That's a very small mechanism. So if that doesn't make sense to you, it doesn't matter that much. Just being complete here for a full analysis of the subject. Finally, we've got this increase in what we call lateral force transmission. Now, this is the one that really I just need to walk through over the space of 2 minutes, because even though it's not enormously important, it does actually require us to understand what's going on. When we talk about muscle fibers, we talk about them essentially contracting and then transmitting that force to the tendon. How do they do that? Well, they don't do it the way that people think. And this is really, really a big deal. So we tend to think that the muscle fiber just pulls on the neighboring sarcomeres along the chain. So if you've got a muscle fiber made up of sarcomeres, and essentially you're visualizing that with each sarcomere pulling on the next one, pulling on the next one, pulling on the next one, all the way down to the tendon. It doesn't work like that. And the reason it doesn't work like that is because if it did, then the only force you would be able to see at the end of the fiber where it pulls on the tendon would be a single sarcomere's worth of force. That's how, strings work. If you pull on a string, the tension has to be identical at every single point. So each sarcomere is going to have the same amount of force. And in order to have each sarcomere contribute independently to the tendon, what happens is the sarcomere actually pulls on the endomysium, which is the surrounding tube around the muscle fiber. Now, as a result of doing that, each sarcomere can now act independently on the tendon and use some sarcomere forces instead of having them essentially, be, just one sarcomere's worth of force along the whole muscle fiber. Now, as a result, if you add new sarcomere, this is what I was saying about sarcomerogenesis, if you add new sarcomeres in series and they are clipped to the endomysium, they will contribute to additional force of that muscle fiber because you're basically adding contractile units, they're acting independently of each other. So, of course, you add muscle fiber force.
Can I give a little analogy here, or metaphor? And it's not perfect, but it's what's coming to mind for me as you're speaking. So imagine you're playing tug of war, and what you're saying is if instead of each person having the hands on the rope, if you had maybe one person who had the hands on the rope and everyone else on their side was holding onto each other, like they're linking hands and they were all connected to each other and not to the rope, and only one person's connected to the rope, then you're only essentially getting that one person's, capacity of force.
If you had everybody linked in a chain, you are limited by the weakest link in that chain.
As opposed to everyone then places their hands on the rope, and that's lateral force transmission.
Some forces, you do, correct.
That's the only point I wanted to make. Hopefully that's helped some people.
No, that's very, very helpful. I'm stealing that. So basically lateral force transmission allows us to make sarcomerogenesis work in an identical way to hypertrophy itself. Additionally, and this is the mechanism of lateral force transmission uniquely, if you have a muscle fiber that does not have every single sarcomere attached to its endomysium already, you can do an additional process where you can add new costomeres which clip the existing sarcomeres into that endomysium, and now you make the muscle fiber stronger, and as a result it contributes to an increase in the muscle fiber force even without adding new contractile material. So lateral force transmission increases the strength of the fiber. Importantly, it slows the muscle fiber shortening velocity down, because if you have 2 unit sarcomeres next to each other, then essentially if they don't have costomeres in the intervening section between the 2 sarcomeres, that double sarcomere, which you've got basically, will shorten essentially twice as fast as 2 sarcomeres which are both clipped into the endomysium independently. As a result, if you go into a muscle fiber that has very few costomeres and all of its sarcomeres are kind of acting longitudinally rather than laterally, you have a very fast muscle fiber. If you start adding costomeres into that fiber, it will slow down dramatically. It will increase its force production quite a lot, but it will slow down dramatically. You can therefore see what happens, and the Robert Erskine studies have been brilliant at illustrating this. If you look at the way in which an increase in lateral force transmission contributes to increases in strength, increases in power, increases in velocity, actually what you see is a increase in strength that's quite substantial, either a no change in power or slight decrease, and a reduction in muscle fiber shortening velocity. So you tilt the force-velocity relationship of that, or force-velocity profile rather, of that muscle fiber quite dramatically as a result of that adaptation. So when people look at these sort of situations and they go, interestingly, I can increase lateral force transmission and that changes the power output of the muscle fiber or the muscle or the exercise that I'm doing. Yes, it will do, but you have to understand why that's happening. The strength has actually gone up. Power has either stayed the same or decreased slightly, and muscle fiber shortening velocity has gone down. And that's because of the mechanism by which this adaptation is actually happening. So those are what I would describe as the 6 or maybe 7, depending on how you define hypertrophy as being, whether it's just fiber hypertrophy plus sarcomerogenesis or just both at the same time. You've got 3 mechanisms of three neural adaptations, which are mechanisms of strength gains. You've got these 3 peripheral mechanisms. Some people also talk about increases in muscle fiber, increases in rate coding, which is an increase in the firing frequency of motor units, that doesn't actually contribute to strength gains. That's a factor that contributes to an increase in speed. We only really see that happening in fast movement situations. We don't tend to see that happening at the low velocity end of the spectrum. You could also, for completeness, say, well, what about increases in myofibrillar density? Well, yeah, so this is a really interesting thing about sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. I get a lot of questions about sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. People say, can I make sarcoplasmic hypertrophy happen? Is there a way of training for it? At the moment, data is pretty limited. Don't really know whether you can or can't. There's some interesting mechanistic explanations, and you can go into that. But honestly, I think it's pretty thin. The thing that really kind of makes me sit up and take notice is that if you look at cross-sectional data, you tend to find that people who've been training a long time actually have higher myofibrillar density, as in less relative sarcoplasm to myofibrils than people who've been training for a shorter period of time. Honestly, what I think probably happens is you actually increase the density of myofibrils rather than increasing the volume of sarcoplasm relative to the myofibrils with increasing periods of training. Now, can you train for that? I don't know. I mean, again, thin data, not really sure what's going on, but I mentioned that as a possible, kind of contributor to strength gains over time. The muscle kind of maturity effect that some people maybe talk about, old man strength. I don't know whether that is even a thing, but anyway. And then finally, hyperplasia, does it happen? Can it happen? Yeah, I mean, we're well into speculative territory here again. I think it probably does happen if you push muscle fibers to the point where they start to bump up against their maximum possible diameter in accordance with the size principle of striated muscle. But, like I keep saying to people, they say to me, well, what would happen if that happened? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. It's like... I'm not going to build a speculation on top of a speculation and then find myself building another speculation on top of that. And then before we know what we're talking about, it's like I'm living in a different universe when none of this really applies anymore. Like, I'm happy to take my speculations one step further forwards on top of what the existing literature supports. I'm not going any further than that. So yeah, maybe hyperplasia does happen a little bit. And if it did, obviously it would contribute to a strength gain in the same way that hypertrophy and sarcomerigenesis does. Much more than that, I'm not really going to say. So that hopefully has been a super quick summary of the mechanisms by which we can get stronger. As I say, you can divide it into individual adaptations, and you can then talk about, if you want to, you can talk about how do you target each of those adaptations. And just finishing up on this little kind of section that I've walked us through, if you want to increase strength, you can't do that directly. You have to do that through one of these mechanisms. And this changes everything when you want to write a strength training program. Because what you're going to do now with this knowledge is you're going to look at your strength training program and go, which part of my program is designed to improve coordination? And with that, most likely, reductions in co-activation. But which part of it? What are you actually doing actively to make those things happen? Are you practicing with intent to improve your coordination? Are you using an external focus of attention, for example? Very, very good way of improving coordination. Are you perhaps training in an unfatigued state to make sure that you maximize the quality of your movement and thereby allow yourself to gain those improvements in motor learning? Are you improving motor unit recruitment, or how are you doing that? Are you seeking to maximize recruitment in the exercise that you're doing in order to make sure that adaptation then happens? When it comes to the peripheral side, are you most people who are listening to this podcast know exactly how to target hypertrophy and sarcomerigenesis and those kind of things. But, what are you doing to make those things happen? And is it going to happen in a way that supports the strength goal that you have? And of course, tendon stiffness, are you making that happen? Are you making sure that the tendon is exposed to the heavy loading that triggers that adaptation? And are you triggering lateral force transmission increase as well? Honestly, who knows what makes that adaptation really happen, but it does seem to be associated with heavier loading rather than lighter loading. I wouldn't want to go much further down that road, to be honest, but I think there's definitely a suggestive data to suggest that is the way. So just kind of finalizing this comment, it's like when we're trying to make a strength gain happen, we are actually not trying to make the strength gain happen directly. What we're trying to do is make an adaptation happen. And when you change your perspective and say, I'm not trying to increase strength, I'm trying to increase this adaptation, the way you approach programming alters. And that's why it's very, very difficult to answer questions when people say, you've explained how this hypertrophy works, and you've got this model and it's really simple. Yeah, of course it is. It's one thing. And now you're asking me to model 6 or 7 things and, have a system that you can't do that. it's not a valid construct. You can't have something like a weekly net stimulus model for strength gains because it's not a valid construct. It's six or seven things, and they all respond in different ways to different training variables. So the way to construct a strength training program is many, many, many times more complicated than constructing a hypertrophy training program because you're seeking multiple things happening simultaneously. Or, and maybe this is actually the key to understanding Marvin Eder's periodization approach, maybe he is training different things at different points. Maybe he's going, instinctively, not necessarily physiologically, cognitively, but instinctively, he's thinking, I'm training this aspect of what makes up strength in this period of time, and then I'm moving on. I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking aloud here, but you've got to be thinking in terms of different adaptations rather than, strength as a single thing, because it's not a single thing.
There's a lot I want to ask you around this. Now, I'll try not to take you down too many tangents, but for starters, just to reiterate one important thing you said is we're not talking about strength as one thing. Obviously, we're talking about it as 6 or 7 things. And so you made this point, but in case anyone missed it, obviously you've talked about the weekly net stimulus when it comes to hypertrophy, and you've got this model that predicts based on frequency, based on session volume, based on you can sort of choose your own kind of stimulus period and stuff like that. You can predict what the hypertrophy stimulus over that week would be. And you're saying people are asking you to do this for strength and you can't because strength is not one thing. So you might be able to do it potentially for, coordination or like one of these things, but you can't do it for all 6 or 7 things combined. Now, that in and of itself is potentially new information to some people listening. Some people listening are probably thinking, hang on, I thought hypertrophy was one thing and strength was another. You're telling me strength kind of is this nebulous thing that's all these other things combined. And yeah, that's exactly what you're saying. Now, based on that, what I want to know is of those, let's say 6-ish things, they're not all equally going to contribute to total strength gains, right? So some of these are going to have a larger magnitude of effect than other things. So I'm interested in which are the things which are going to have a bigger impact. And I guess a part of that conversation, some of these things are kind of coming along for the ride. Like some of them we're going to do most likely by virtue of maybe chasing some of these other adaptations. So can you speak into those two things a little bit?
So what we tend to see, and this is one of the biggest problems with analyzing strength gains, is that the relative contributions of each of these adaptations changes according to the exercise that you're doing or training, trying to improve the strength of, and the training status of the person who's doing the training. So to take an extreme example, if you pick a beginner and you ask them to stop training or practicing a multi-joint free weight exercise, you are going to see coordination improvements that shock you. The strength gains will be extraordinary. Like one of my favorite studies tried to, in a very simple way, get under the skin of how much coordination contributes to strength gains. And they actually picked a knee extension exercise because they wanted to limit the magnitude of the effect. They were like, we're going to pick something that we actually think requires almost no coordination at all. And they basically just had people do knee extension training, untrained people do knee extension training. And they basically compared the strength gains in that trained knee extension exercise in the gym with a dynamometer knee extension that was matched as closely as possible to it. Now, the dynamometer is an interesting situation because you strap people in for that exercise. So there's no way you can really do anything other than just rotate the knee. You can't do anything else. There's no positioning yourself on the seat. You can't, stabilize yourself to a greater extent by holding the handles or anything like that. So all of that sort of extraneous stuff that you do when you're sitting on a knee extension machine to position yourself and maximize your performance, you can't do that in a dynamometer. And the dynamometer strength gain was about half what you got from the knee extension in the gym. I'm like, that is incredible. Like what you're telling me is that in a machine knee extension exercise, single joint machine exercise, half the gains in strength of an untrained person over a couple of months training is actually coordination. Now extrapolate that to multi-joint and then extrapolate it again to something like a kind of free weight barbell exercise like a squat or something like that. And then extrapolate it again to something like a one-arm chin-up. And like the jumps in coordination are just absolutely going to be enormous each time that you do that. So what I think is important to start with is that if you have a unstable or less stable exercise, a more difficult to coordinate exercise, something that requires a lot of skill, you are going to find that coordination starts at least half of your strength gains as a beginner and goes upwards from there, probably, exponentially as you're working through that. Now, obviously, once you've got a well-practiced, because we're talking about a skill here, once you have somebody who's practiced that exercise for months, maybe even longer, then of course the contributions of coordination drop off dramatically. But just as a scale of things, I think what we're talking about is that if you're training beginners in a strength training exercise, you're starting from it being half of your strength gains and going upwards from there quite steeply, I think. So this is the problem with strength gains in beginner situations, because what you're going to find is that coordination obliterates anything else that you're going to do. And that's why when people go, why is this strength gain the same in this group that trained with this proximity to failure and that proximity to failure? I'm like, because coordination obliterates everything, absolutely obliterates everything. You're looking at coordination improvements in beginner people as a contributor to strength gains. It is going to be the lion's share of what you're doing. That's just axiomatic.
This is why, presumably, back in the day, people used to say beginners, you would achieve all these neural adaptations first and hypertrophy came second. You know, there used to be this sort of
actually
idea that...
not true, because basically it's the coordination improvements come first. So we've got some really nice data showing you can literally go in the gym and, practice an exercise for, half an hour, come back the following day and your strength is just jumped really, really high upwards from that first day, like tens of percents upwards. That is what's happening with the untrained population when they're exposed to an exercise that they've not done before. Neural adaptations regards co-activation reductions are very slow. Neural adaptations regarding motor unit recruitment increases are delayed by a couple of weeks. So what the hypertrophy researchers believed initially was that you got your neural adaptations first and then hypertrophy came second. Not actually true. The coordination improvements happen first, and then you start to see some hypertrophy, and then you start to see the increases in recruitment, and then much later on you start to see the reductions in co-activation. Now, strictly speaking, everything is happening more or less simultaneously. I don't actually think the recruitment increases happen until the coordination is at the point where you can actually devote all of your maximum tolerable perception effort to recruiting motor units instead of, kind of worrying about the fact the exercise is getting away from you because it's difficult. But ultimately, that's the kind of timelines that we tend to see. So coordination is the thing that's kind of dominating that first kind of week or two of training. But the point I'm making here is that is why when people are confused by strength gains in beginners and they're like, why is this weird? Why are we seeing all of these strength training programs produce more or less the same strength gains regardless of what training variables we throw at them? It's because coordination is getting in the way. It's such an enormous factor.
And so then you've got someone who is a more advanced lifter and they've rehearsed some of these lifts for potentially years. Then at that point, what are going to be the main contributors to increasing their strength level on that lift?
Yeah, so what we tend to see in the literature is that the coordination has this enormous increase in the early weeks of practicing a new lift. Neural adaptations wise, as I say, recruitment tends to be dominating in the next sort of 3 to 6 months. That tends to be the period of time in which most recruitment gains happen. It does continue increasing after that, but much more slowly. And technical activation takes a very, very long time to max out, like years. So I think, when people say, oh, well, trained lifters don't get neural adaptations. Well, yes, they do. It's just predominantly a reduction in co-activation rather than anything else. On the peripheral side, of course, you've got the hypertrophy, the sarcomerogenesis. Sarcomerogenesis in a particular exercise is going to max out within months. So that, again, is not really going to be a trained lifter issue. Tendon stiffness is a tricky one. It probably scales with load on the bar. So I think it's a lifetime adaptation. As long as load carries on increasing, you're going to see tendon stiffness changes. Lateral force transmission probably does cap out at a certain point because you can't add costamers to a fiber if it's full of costamers. The places for adding costamers don't exist, so you're not going to get any more of that. So what we tend to see then is you can create a scenario or you can create an imaginary model where you go, well, what is going to be, like, take the opposite example of what we talked about earlier. If we have a very well-trained bodybuilder who's been doing knee extensions for 3 years plus, what's going to contribute to an increase in their knee extension from week to week? Well, there's not really much that can contribute in that scenario apart from hypertrophy. It just isn't. And that's why when, you talk to lifters who've been training many, many, many years and they're improving knee extension strength or, kind of lateral raise strength on a machine or something very stable where they're not really going to see a coordination change or anything like that, they're talking like it takes them 3 or 4 weeks to add a rep. Well, yeah, because the only thing that can contribute in that situation is the hypertrophy. And I think that's why when in the past I've talked about using progressive overload as a marker for making, being confident that you're adding muscle size over time, it's in that context. It's in the context of me talking to somebody who's got multiple years of training behind them, and they've got exercises that they've practiced that are very stable, and they're doing a very consistent routine week on week on week, and they're taking a couple of weeks to add repetitions. I'm expecting that hypertrophy is the primary contributor to strength gains in that situation.
You mentioned a lateral raise. So I've been training now for coming on close to 2 decades, and throughout that whole time I would have been doing lateral raises, and I did a video on this not too long ago where I was using a new lateral raise machine. Obviously, it's a very stable exercise and there's not a whole lot of variation in that type of exercise. And just using this new machine, I was adding about 1 new plate every single week for probably about maybe not quite a month, but several weeks.
Yeah. And it's really, really difficult to, unless you go looking for this stuff, you don't realize it's happening. It's like, but yeah, absolutely. You go and you sit yourself down on a new machine and you're like, oh, wow, this is amazing. It's like, it's so much fun because the weights are just going up and up and up. And you're like, this is coordination. I'm getting myself used to this new situation. And then suddenly you just hit a wall with it. And it's like, no, you can't do that anymore.
And then you go find a new machine.
You go and find a new machine to play around on, yeah. But that's the point. It's like, what are we really doing this for? Are we doing this as entertainment, or are we doing this as for the purpose of increasing muscle size? And the problem is that if coordination is, just kind of jumping back from this and talking about hypertrophy training for a moment, because we're trying to talk about strength gains here very, very quickly. And I know we're rushing through this, but we have limited time to do this. But just briefly talking about hypertrophy for a moment. If our purpose is to maximize muscle growth, we don't want a situation where coordination is a limiter, because if your brain is devoting effort to the cognitive process of coordinating the movement for you, because you can't do it instinctively, you are not able to maximize motor unit recruitment. That's not going to happen. We actually want to get very quickly to the point where this very rapid strength gain isn't happening. So if we take a step back and go, oh yes, we accept that it's fun to see these numbers jumping upwards over week on week on week, but actually it's bad because it tells us that we're not actually maxing recruitment out in that period of time. We want to be in a situation that actually nobody wants to be in, which is the grinding bit where you basically week on week just hitting the same numbers, and you're like, is this ever going to increase in the repetitions? Then finally you see the number go up 1 repetition, and you're like, fantastic, okay.
Well, that's exactly the point I wanted to make, and I wanted to actually go down that path a little bit further, because I think it's an important point for people who do obviously want to focus on hypertrophy. The point I was making is I'm a fairly advanced lifter and I'm still seeing that. So how long do we think some of these coordination improvements, even in these stable exercises, how long is one likely to actually experience this big chunk of coordination improvement occurring for? Like, presumably we're going to see that for weeks, maybe up to a month or so? What would you anticipate?
It's absolutely a non-linear relationship. So you go in and you start practicing the exercise. And just again, clarifying for people so they understand, motor learning is a instantaneous learning process. So if you start practicing, your brain is instantaneously in that moment upgrading your software, if you like, to make you better at that thing. You don't need to go home and sleep on it. The brain is doing it instantaneously. So if you sit down on the machine and you do a couple of repetitions and you do them with the goal of improving your movement quality, you will instantaneously improve that. If you then walk around the gym a bit, come back, you should now be stronger.
You see this if you're a lifter who's done an exercise in the past and then you haven't done it for a month and you come back to doing that exercise, your first set, you'll be significantly weaker, and you come back and do a second set and you'll be significantly stronger in that second set.
Your brain just, like, the process of how the brain stores and retrieves information is obviously still pretty opaque to us. But my mental model for how it works is just that the information never goes anywhere. You actually store everything. It just becomes a little bit harder to retrieve it if you bury it under other stuff. And I'm not saying that's exactly what happens. It just, for me, that mental model works really, really well, because if you think of it in that terms, it's like, yes, I did this particular overhead press or this lateral raise machine, 6 months ago and I was then in a different city, and now I come back and I sit down at the first time and it doesn't seem to work. And then, as you say, you walk around the gym, you come back, and immediately it's like it's better again. Now that learning process is way too fast to be a true new learning process. It's like the brain's just figured out where it stored that information. It's now retrieved it again, and now you're doing it the way that you were doing it before. So this like coordination never goes anywhere. It just gets buried under other stuff. Now, neuroscientists can tell me that I'm talking rubbish, but the model for me actually works pretty well for as far as I want to use it. So basically, yeah, we kind of want to avoid that situation as far as possible, but it is a thing that does carry on happening. Now, non-linear changes are very noticeable. So we see these huge improvements when we start practicing a new machine, and we start to see slower and slower improvements on top of that, and it starts to plateau. But it never really fully plateaus. So you just end up with this very, very, very slowly ascending line that just carries on going up forever. And ultimately, it's just because the brain is always collecting information. And if it notices that you've just randomly done something that was even fractionally superior to what it was doing the previous time, it just upgrades its model. And yeah, those upgrades are tiny, but they are still there. So coordination is one of those things that just carries on happening. It just happens less quickly the further down the road.
But there's still a threshold at some point where once you get to that point, now you can start to see more increases in things like motor unit recruitment. Right.
Of course, because it's the perception. What we don't want is we don't want a situation in which we perceive that the exercise is requiring cognitive resources from us to control. You're basically looking for a scenario where you're instinctively controlling the weight without having to devote your conscious mind.
Almost a point where it feels like second nature to do that movement.
Yeah. So the threshold we're looking for is the point at which the exercise doesn't really require any cognitive resources, because then you're devoting all cognitive resources to effort. Ultimately, this is why, we point people towards more stable stuff and easier stuff, because you just kind of get to that threshold much more quickly. You can get to that threshold with more complicated exercises. It just requires a lot more months of practice.
So from a practical standpoint or application standpoint, so what we've just said there is it takes a while to get to this point where you're coordinated enough that you're going to see these other adaptations take place a bit more quickly. Now, that means that there has to be enough rehearsing of that particular movement that takes place. So when I see people program and they program an exercise, say once per week, just from a coordination standpoint, what that's going to do is slow down that timeline or stretch out that timeline of achieving those coordination improvements, right? Like if you're doing an exercise once per week compared to doing it 2 or 3 times per week, then obviously it's going to take you longer to get to that said point.
Yeah, exactly. And if you'll forgive me, I'm just going to expand this point and hijack it very, very slightly to link back to something that I mentioned earlier, which is that I can't build a weekly net stimulus model for strength gains because strength isn't a valid construct in the way that hypertrophy is a single construct. The coordination improvements that we are trying to achieve in this situation have a completely different profile across the week from something like hypertrophy. So when we talk about hypertrophy, we have this stimulus period, we have an atrophy thing going on, we have the stimulus that we can achieve that's non-linear in the workout. Okay, great. We understand that. We put that together in a model and we end up with the weekly net stimulus model. Coordination basically will improve if you show the brain a better way of doing what you're doing than you're already doing. That's it. It's literally, that's the only thing that matters. If you perform the movement and the brain notices, because it has an effort perception sensor built into it, which we all know. So we have an effort perception sensor. Your brain does the movement. If your brain notices that, that's interesting, what you just did was less effortful than what you previously did. So I'm going to upgrade what you previously did with this new motor program. We're going to do that one going forward. That's kind of how coordination improvements work. So on that basis, if you can do that every 10 minutes every day forever, then you'll just carry on improving coordination forever. And actually, if you look at sports like snooker or, sort of other like darts, for example, where there's no fatigue really, then you can practice those for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours every single day and just carry on getting better because there's no limiter, because fatigue is the thing that really breaks down movement patterns and starts to stop us from actually upgrading the ones that we've got, because it makes the ones that we're doing now worse than the one that the brain has stored, so it just doesn't upgrade anything. So you can basically see situations where like coordination follows an absolutely completely different pattern. You can just go in the gym and practice a lift, and if you don't create so much fatigue that your next lift then suffers, so you just do singles with several reps in reserve and you just keep doing those, you're just going to carry on getting better. And there's nothing that's going to stop that from happening as long as fatigue isn't there, because it's an instantaneous upgrade process. So you can't map that on top of a hypertrophy net stimulus model. You can't map those two things because they're absolutely, completely incompatible. And like people say to me, well, how can I program for strength gains? I'm like, you can't. You can improve coordination as a goal. You can improve recruitment as a goal. You can improve muscle size as a goal. So all of these different things are different goals. And ultimately, they're not going to sit in the same model. It just cannot work. And I guess I'm getting a little bit kind of emphatic about this because I just received so many questions of people saying, please build a strength model. I'm like, you don't understand what it is you're asking me to do. It's actually impossible. I'm not saying that because I'm trying to make it sound difficult. It's not difficult. It's impossible. The two things are different.
Yeah.
So ultimately, coordination is a really amazing way to illustrate that, because you can literally just improve indefinitely as long as you don't interfere with the movement program, the quality of the motor program that you're actually engaging in. And fatigue is the primary reason why that's going to happen.
It makes things quite murky, because when you were saying that, it made me think, well, the classic piece of advice is someone's plateaued on a lift. What do people say to do? You take that lift and you put it first in a workout. Okay, I understand that you're now training that in an unfatigued state, and so the idea is that there potentially is, more motor unit recruitment going into that exercise. But what you said there is, well, actually, you're training it in an unfatigued state, so now you might actually see more coordination improvements as well. So when we're talking about progressive overload, it actually gets very murky as to what is it that's causing that progressive overload. We can't separate it out into, is it just hypertrophy or is it these other adaptations?
Absolutely. I mean, the main reason I ask people to put the lift first is because you're more likely to hit a higher level of motor unit recruitment if you put it first. So you're going to get access to more muscle fibers, and you might even see an increase in recruitment. So that, again, is, as you say, murky. It's the problem. The problem is you're doing multiple things at the same time. You're improving the chances of coordination gains. You're improving the chances of recruitment gains. You're improving the chances of hypertrophy because of those recruitment increases and the improvement in the gains in recruitment. It's like all of these things are happening simultaneously, and sometimes they are moving in the same direction as each other. And so you can say, okay, well then that's all good. But actually sometimes they go in opposite directions from each other. Like we were just talking about a moment ago, coordination and hypertrophy being completely and utterly different strategies for making those two sets of adaptations happen. So again, like strength gains is not a vanilla. It is a extremely complicated problem, and the only way you're going to make sense of it is to break it down into its component adaptations, pick an adaptation or multiple adaptations that you think are most valuable to chase after those and make them happen, and then pick something else. And again, maybe this is why periodization is useful practically for making a strength training program work, because you pick something to work on and you work on that, and then you pick something else to work on and you work on that. And then maybe that allows you to make maximum progress over time.
I'm sure there's going to be a lot of additional questions as to, how to focus on those particular adaptations, and maybe that could be something we do in a future episode. But the last question I have for you is, I touched on kind of the murkiness with progressive overload, and obviously with these adaptations, some of these do not or are not tied to hypertrophy. And then obviously hypertrophy is tied or is one of these adaptations that leads to an increase in strength. Can we just go down that path for a moment longer? Because that seems to be a bit of a misconception online that that hypertrophy does not equal increases in strength, and yet you're saying it actually is one of these adaptations that leads to an increase in strength.
Absolutely. So essentially what we have to do is understand that you can increase strength without increasing muscle size. So that's the first starting point, because as you just pointed out, hypertrophy, and I'm just going to wrap sarcomerigenesis up into that for the purposes of this conversation, because it doesn't really matter. So an increase in muscle size, hypertrophy, is a mechanism of strength gains, but I can also increase strength by improving coordination, by reducing co-activation, all those other things. So yes, and you can pick climbers as my favorite example, like a sport that I do have a passing acquaintance with. You can pick climbers as a great example of a group of people who can get absurdly strong, just frighteningly strong, without really adding a lot of muscle mass. So ultimately, yes, we can see very large gains in strength, and you can construct a training program, as hopefully what I've just spent the last half an hour explaining. You can construct a training program that will add a lot of strength to a particular lift without necessarily seeing an increase in muscle size. So that starting point is absolutely true. And that is the focus of a lot of the engagement and discussion and an argument online, is people observing that repeatedly and then doing a victory lap. And that victory lap is premature, because that's not what anybody is saying when they're pointing out that hypertrophy is connected to an increase in strength. That's not what they're saying. They're not saying that at all. What they're saying is, if you actually do start increasing the size of a muscle fiber in the context of an exercise, and then you go back and you measure the strength of that exercise, the strength of that exercise will have gone up. Now, the reason I say that is because if you understand how neuromechanical matching works, neuromechanical matching is not going to use a muscle fiber for an exercise unless that muscle fiber contributes to joint torque in that exercise. So if your brain is going, okay, which motor units am I going to use to make this movement happen? It goes, okay, these are the motor units that I'm going to use to make that movement happen. Let's say I'm doing a biceps curl or a lat pull down or something like that. And my brain goes, I need these muscle fibers to contribute. Or, no, it doesn't think that. It thinks I need these motor units to that particular exercise, and it recruits them. Great, no problem. The muscle fibers that are part of those motor units have got leverage to do that activity. If I now go and add myofibrils or sarcomeres inside those muscle fibers, I've now got bigger muscle fibers that produce more force, and they are connected to the tendon, and they are part of the motor units that have leverage. Therefore, I now have I produce a larger joint torque. There isn't really a scenario outside of sort of outlier situations in which adding myofibrils to those muscle fibers fails to increase joint torque. The only scenario in which you could really do that would be if maybe you were lacking a lot of costamers in a particular muscle fiber that was part of a motor unit, but that would be like almost instantaneously fixed, because you would immediately start adding those costamers, because the internal nature of the muscle fiber lacking costamers would immediately cause it to start adding new costamers. So you'd fix that problem almost instantaneously. So even those outlier situations would get fixed. And when I say outlier, I think you're not going to see that happening most of the time, but you theoretically could imagine it occurring. The point I'm making is that because neuromechanical matching works the way it does, if you have a muscle fiber that's been loaded in an exercise, it will contribute to strength gains in that exercise simply because it has leverage, and therefore it is going to contribute to joint torque. You can't have a muscle fiber that's being activated as a result of a recruitment process and it not contribute to joint torque. It will do. And I think this is the nature of the debate, which is that on the one hand, yes, you can increase strength without increasing muscle size, and nobody who understands the physiology is debating that. On the opposite side of the equation, you have this comment, which I'm standing behind, which is that if you are testing strength in the trained exercise, then the muscle fibers you've used and loaded and hypertrophied will contribute to joint torque in the exercise that you've been training, because that's how neuromechanical matching works. This is one of those great examples where you actually have to use multiple areas of physiology to form your model. If you just go into a situation and go, well, we don't know. Well, yeah, we do know. The number of times I hear hypertrophy researchers, influencers say, well, we don't know. And I'm like, well, speak for yourself, because I think the model is actually very clear. When they say they don't know, what they mean is we don't want to do the reading outside of that area to inform us on how this thing might work. It's like, well, that's your problem. You know, I'm just kind of reading stuff and trying to make connections and figure out how all of these things fit together and how it makes sense. I've been very lucky in the sense that other people seem to think that analysis works. Well, great, fantastic. You know, I'm glad it helps, but I'm doing this because I'm interested in how this works. And I think that the neuromechanical matching principle is an amazing key that unlocks a lot of these problems. And this is one of those where it actually does inform as well, which is to say that I'm not going to see a scenario in which muscle fibers are growing but don't then contribute to the exercise in which they were trained in, because neuromechanical matching which wouldn't let that happen.
It's odd that it's even contentious, because, I mean, that's just what progressive overload is. So it's strange that people are happy unanimously to agree that progressive overload matters and is the backbone of hypertrophy training. And yet there still seems to be some contention as to whether hypertrophy will always contribute to strength, or whether, I guess ultimately that, you know, can you get stronger or can you get bigger without actually getting stronger? That seems to still be a debate, which doesn't make a lot of sense
I think the reasons behind that are sociological rather than whatever it is that we're doing here. I think ultimately what it comes back to is and this is absolutely not something I want to get derailed into, but I think what it comes back to is, what's your framework for establishing how something works? The framework that I'm using is to gather as much information that's available as possible from as many sources as possible that I think are sufficiently trustworthy to use. And that's why I really enjoy these conversations that we have, where we bring in information from anecdotal data that's pre-steroids. Because, as I've said repeatedly for the last however many years, if somebody has anecdotal data today, I just ignore it, in the nicest possible way, because I just don't know. It doesn't meet my threshold for trustworthiness. Like, the person can say, well, I don't use anabolics. I'm like, well, thank you for telling me that information, but I don't know whether it's true or not. So I'm just going to go back to a point when I know for a fact that they didn't take anabolics because they didn't exist. And now suddenly I have this confidence in those anecdotal data that I don't have in the anecdotal data of today. And so, incorporating that, and I bring in everything I can about exercise physiology from every single place that I've managed to gather information, and you form it into a picture that starts to make sense. And that's been, I feel, incredibly successful in connecting dots and making a picture that works. On the other hand, on the other side, what I see people doing who criticize this approach that I take, what I see people doing is drawing a box around a certain very limited amount of data that they think is acceptable for including in forming a conclusion. And they go, we're only prepared to incorporate these. And if you take that to an extreme, what you find is that some people say, the only studies I'm prepared to look at for answering this question that I have are those studies that were designed literally to answer that question. So, for example, they might say, when it comes to stretch-mediated hypertrophy, the only studies I'm interested in kind of looking at are these training studies that have compared training at different, joint angle ranges of motion. I'm like, well, so you don't want to talk about sarcomerigenesis literature because you don't think that's relevant. You don't want to talk about neuromechanical matching because that changes which muscle is getting used in different parts of the joint angle range of motion. You're going to have a really hard time explaining how things work and understanding how things work, literally using those 12 studies that you've identified as being the only acceptable ones for answering that question. If you literally just bring in exercise physiology from neuromechanical matching and sarcomerigenesis, your debate goes away and you can move on and solve another problem. But in those, and we had like a year or two ago, people having literally this exact problem where they said, no, we don't want to talk about your exercise physiology, kind of investigations that you've pulled all this data together and you've used it to answer the question that we're wrestling with. We just want to use our 10 studies that we think are. Look who's managed to get to the right answer, though. After all this time, they're kind of, that group of people has now almost vanished from the internet. What we used to call the stretch cult, they're pretty much gone. I mean, maybe I don't know. I don't follow what goes on. You know me, I just live in my own little world. So maybe I'm mistaken, but I don't see them having the same clout as they did a year or so ago. Whereas a lot of people now are talking about sarcomerigenesis and neuromechanical matching, they're accepting those concepts. And it's like, I think rejecting information out of hand is an error. I think the people who are trying to limit the inclusion of information is definitely going to find that they suffer in terms of their ability to find the answers to questions, whereas people who are prepared to incorporate more information, as long as that information has a trustworthy characteristic to it, they're going to find that they are more likely to reach a satisfactory answer. So again, I think we could talk for hours about the sociological reasons why people are doing this. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. And there's a group of people who we're talking to who like to include lots of information and try and piece it together. And then there's a group of people who we're not talking to who, get a bit aggravated with us, who are trying to limit the information and just go, we only want to talk about these tiny number of studies because our, epistemological approach or whatever it is you want to describe it as requires us to limit the sources of information to solving the question. Now, why people do those, why people take those two approaches is a philosophical question, and also sociological question, I should say, that you could spend hours analyzing. But that's why we are where we are, because our fundamental approaches to answering questions are different.
I've always found that interesting, where there's often this sort of idea of like, in the particular field you're in, like that's where you need to find those answers. And if an answer pops up in an adjacent field, it's like, well, that's not kind of okay. I can't take that on board for whatever reason. It's a competing belief, competing field, whatever. And I've always thought, well, hang on, no matter where that sort of truth or that information pops up or that knowledge pops up, like that is, if we're seeking what's true, then we should be integrating that regardless of where we're finding it.
And you know where I'm coming from with this. I see it as a sociological phenomenon whereby gatekeeping is a power play. Gatekeep the power of your field by limiting the number of people who have the right to comment and argue. And that's why you see people at the moment saying, you can't use that information to answer this question. I'm like, stop me. Go ahead, stop me. You can't. I can draw whatever conclusions I want from whatever data I want. You can tell me that my opinion is not important to you as a result of me taking that approach, and I'm going to turn around and say, I don't care. Because I don't need your approval. This is fascinating to me, where people say, oh, you can't use that data to answer that question. And I'm like, yeah, I can. You may not approve of me, but I'm not seeking your approval. I'm not part of your community. I'm doing my own thing. And if people are interested in that, that's fantastic. I'm glad to help, but I don't need that. And this is what the internet has done in many ways. It's kind of allowed everybody to be able to just present their views, and it's broken down a lot of those barriers to the gatekeepers. And the gatekeepers are now finding that they're fighting a losing battle, because if somebody has a better way of answering a question, which I think I have got a better way of answering these questions, then people just start adopting that. And like, they find themselves now screeching and saying, no, you can't do that. You're not allowed to do that. We don't approve of that. And like, well, we don't care. So it is a sociological phenomenon, what we're seeing here, in the sense that, one group of people is saying, no, we're gatekeeping the way that this question can be answered. And maybe before the internet, that would have been, or social media especially, that would have been possible to gatekeep. You'd have been able to do that. And now you can't. And now you've got this situation where, like an entire generation or the next generation of exercise scientists are growing up listening to us and these issues being talked about. And they will then go into exercise science with these approaches and thought processes behind them. And there'll be a conflict in terms of this one gatekeeping approach and one much more open approach. And we're going to see some conflict there. And that's a sociologically fascinating situation that I'm not going to have to deal with. So I can just kind of sit and watch it and go, it's like a slow motion kind of collision happening. But it's very, very interesting to watch. And I think, I'm going to be curious to see how many people start to notice it happening. Or how many people just kind of go along with it. Because what you'll find, obviously, is some people just, carry on with the gatekeeping approach because it suits them and because, that's just habitual for them and that's what they're used to. And then there's other people, as we're seeing, who are just going to go along with the, like, well, what information have you got? Use whatever's useful. And I think it's very attractive for people who are not part of the old system and are not benefiting from the gatekeeping approach to actually use that. Well, what information have you got? Because ultimately, practicality is to use whatever you've got rather than be a gatekeeper and say, well, no, you're only allowed to use these 5 things because those are the sanctioned thing. Yeah, so anyway, rambled extensively there at the end, and topics that I really shouldn't have rambled on because they're not my area of expertise, but hopefully that would have been interesting.
Well, I think it's helpful as a final point on that for people who are listening. When you do, whether we present something or whether someone else presents something, if someone is saying you can't do this or you can't, make that argument or whatever, simply assess based on what, based on what evidence can you not make that claim, right? And I think what I see happening is that, people will hear someone say you can't do X and they'll say, well, this person said that, therefore that opinion is, or that belief is right or whatever. And then someone else might say, but Chris said you can, and therefore you can. And that's not the right approach either. Like, ultimately, the right approach, in my opinion, would be to actually assess both of those arguments for their own individual merit. So as opposed to just aligning yourself. Knowledge-wise,
I would say you can do anything.
Fair. Yep.
What we would do is we would say, you can do that. You can make any argument you like. You can. It's just that the weight of that argument will be scaled downwards in accordance with the validity of the information in the context that you are using it. So you can bring in all kinds of arguments into the equation. Most of them are going to have a modifier of like such a low number that they become essentially irrelevant. So you just say they're not relevant. So terminology wise, you can do pretty much anything. The reason I'm highlighting the usage of the word can and should in these contexts, and I made a story about this on Instagram, I say modal verbs are tricky, because they kind of tell you that the person who is using them is framing themselves as an authority figure who is gatekeeping. They're saying, we, the authority are telling you that what you can and can't do. Now, again, trying to stay on track here and avoid derailing myself yet again, that's just an indicator of the strategy that they are taking in this sociological situation. My situation is like, well, you can do anything you like in this context of arguing something, but I might say that I don't accept your argument because I don't think it has any weight. And that's a separate approach. I'm accepting all information. I just will dismiss the conclusion if I think it's irrelevant. But when somebody starts using modal verbs, for me, that's a gigantic red flag that they are positioning themselves as a gatekeeper, as an authority figure. And straight away, again, trying to avoid derailing myself here, straight away I frame that in that way.
Well, you did a good job at summarizing exactly the purpose of this podcast and why we started this in the first place, which was to combine these new elements of what you're talking about and these the knowledge and the information, the data that we can obtain from all these different areas and the questions we can flesh out and pursue, and how we can then examine this anecdotal evidence, if you will, from the past. So hopefully you guys are enjoying these episodes. Chris, is there anything else without derailing you that you want to finish off?
No, I'm absolutely all good
for today.
Done. I need to stop.
Well, thank you guys for tuning in. Hopefully you've enjoyed our episode on strength and sociology, and we hope you'll join us again next week.